Father Msgr, thanks very much. I'm sorry to inform you that if adoration is happening right after my talk, then I am a warm-up act. Like the consummate one. Bishop Fulda, Bishop Cousins, good brothers and sisters in Christ, I'm happy to be here with you tonight. When I saw Bishop Fulda, he said, "I'm glad you're here." And I said to him, "We'll see what you think afterward." Because I'm here to give you the bad news, and I'm hoping that someone who comes after me will cheer you up before the weekend is over. Yeah, I want to start by simply noting that things are much, much worse than they seem. Things are worse than they seem. This Eucharistic revival of the Bishops' Conference is one of the most important things which will happen in our lifetimes. I'm so very pleased and thrilled about it as president of the University of Marion. We're taking it very seriously on our campus, and each of us should give our full support to this effort. My understanding of the origin of the Eucharistic revival in the country came about when Bishop Robert Barron was the chairman of the Bishops' Committee on Evangelization and Catechesis, and the most recent Pew Form study came out on Catholics' belief in the Blessed Sacrament. And the results of that were profoundly discouraging, such that the bishops began to discuss the idea of a Eucharistic revival. Bishop Cousins now of the Diocese of Crookston is the current chairman of the Committee on Evangelization and Catechesis, and I understand, of course, he has a deep charism, deep love for the Eucharist. You'll hear him tomorrow here from this ambo, from this lectern, and he's continuing that great work and announced the Eucharistic revival. So this Pew Form study said that 75% of Catholics don't believe what the Catholic Church teaches about the Eucharist. And if you go to people under the age of 40, that number shoots up to 80% or more. And even among observant Catholics, those who go to Mass at least once a week, 37% of those Catholics don't really believe what the Church teaches about the Blessed Sacrament. And so we have a serious problem. And I'm here to tell you that those statistics are cheerful in comparison with the reality. It seems to me that actually many people who would have answered that study that they do believe what the Church teaches about the Eucharist probably don't actually believe it. And maybe many of us here who are Eucharistic Catholics and who believe in the presence of Jesus in the Eucharist and want others to believe it, we might have a kind of tepid belief in it, or our belief might be marginal, but it's not what it really should be, or it's not what it ought to be. And that has to do with many things. When people heard that I would be speaking to you, they began to write letters to me, because I think people think that college presidents love to receive letters. And I do love to receive letters, and I get a lot of them. And so people said, "Oh, please, would you make sure that you remind the priests present, would you remind your lousy brother priests that they need to be much more clear from the pulpit in teaching about what the Church teaches about the Eucharist. People need to know the truth. They need to know that Jesus is really, truly, and substantially present in the Eucharist, and that it's a central teaching of the Catholic Church." And I think that that's fine and very important, and that kind of clarity is necessary, but it's not enough. Other people said, we need more reverence in our worship. People don't believe in the Eucharist. They don't believe in Jesus' real presence because we're so casual about our worship and liturgy. There needs to be more of a sense of solemnity. There needs to be more sense of reverence. There needs to be greater care taken in the way that we have our postures and our movements during Mass. There has to be more reverent music. We need to have much more sacred art. We need to surround the Eucharist with much more reverence. And I think that that also has a lot of merit and is true, but it also is not enough. Clarity in teaching, reverence in worship are two components of belief. But I don't think that the crisis in Eucharistic belief in the Catholic Church comes primarily from those two sources. I think that there's something else at work here that we need to come face to face with. And in order to tell you about it, I have to talk about magic. On Tuesday, I was on a national radio program, and the host, without warning me beforehand, opened up the phones. And so a woman called in from the Twin Cities and identified herself as Julie and said, I grew up Catholic and I was taught what the Catholic Church teaches about the Eucharist. I have read the Catechism front to back. I have read many papal encyclicals. I am a well-informed layperson, and I want nothing to do with what the Catholic Church teaches about the Eucharist. I was brought up in the faith. I knew that we were supposed to be reverent. I'm crystal clear about what the Church teaches, but I don't believe it, and I don't think anybody else should believe it either. I want you, Father, to tell me what the difference is between what the Church teaches and does at Mass and magic. What's the difference between magic and what the Church teaches? Now, how many of you could do better than I did in answering that question? I don't know, and that might be one of the reasons that I said that things are worse than they really are. Because the distinction between magic and scientific knowledge is very blurry, and it forms a kind of substrate which makes it very difficult for those of us who live in the modern world to have the fierce allegiance to the invisible world that disciples of Jesus Christ, devout Catholics, and the saints that we are called to be really have. So there have traditionally been two kinds of knowledge. One is science, and one is magic or sorcery. Many people in the past have accused the Catholic Church of magic in respect to its teaching on the Eucharist. The phrase hocus pocus, have you heard of that? Hocus pocus. That comes from the Latin for the words of consecration in the Mass. This is my body, hoc est enim corpus meum. Hocus pocus. And some sources say, not knowing if they're credible or not, that the hokey pokey, that children's game, that the hokey pokey is modeled off a barb or a parody of the Catholic Mass. What does the priest do? He puts his right hand in and his right hand out, and his right hand in, he shakes it all about. He says, hoc est enim corpus meum, and he turns himself around. That's what it's all about. Magic. The point of science, the point of scientific magic, which is not just a few hundred years old. Science has been around since human beings started thinking. The point of science is to understand the workings of the natural world. And the point of magic is to manipulate the forces inherent in the world for the sake of power. And at the time of the scientific revolution of the 17th century, there was a tremendous resurgence of interest in both the natural sciences and also in magic. And this vision of what magic was all about, power to manipulate the forces in nature so that we can have authority, so that we can garner power, was at the root of some of the forces behind the scientific revolution. Sir Francis Bacon, who was Lord Chancellor of England, I did my master's thesis on him. He was the one who famously said, knowledge is power. And he said that nature is like a woman whom we need to seduce so that we can get secrets out of her. We need to seduce her even by force, and we can get her to give up her secrets. Some of the early scientists of that revolution, people like Isaac Newton and Robert Boyle, were as interested in alchemy and astrology as they were in chemistry and physics. But the natural sciences tended to work better, and so they won out, and that's what we went with. But modern science has maintained much of the underlying motive of magic, which is to control nature. And as a result, there's a whole worldview, a whole vision of reality which has emerged out of it and which has captivated our minds, a kind of scientism, a kind of materialism. This is the way that we see the world. Everything in the world can be measured. Everything in the world can be experimented upon. And very few people are willing anymore to ask this crucial question: just because we can do something, should we do it? Christian Smith is a sociologist at Notre Dame. And he said that this vision, this view of the world is so prevalent that he was able to do a study on young people who were raised in religious homes and have lost or abandoned their faith. And he asked, when did that happen and why? And for the majority of people, it was at the age of 13. And the reason why was, I came to realize that faith wasn't coherent with what I was being taught. It didn't make sense to me. I didn't believe in an invisible world any more than I would believe in the tooth fairy. My parents had taught me religion, and I believed it as a child, but that didn't have any staying power for me. When I got a little bit older, I wasn't interested in it anymore. And everything surrounding me, my education, my entertainment, was pushing me in another direction. And so I went in another direction. But Catholic worship of the Eucharist is not magic in this way. We are not seeking mastery over simply the natural world. We're not manipulating the forces of nature so as to gain power. What we're doing in worship is not hocus pocus. Instead, we are taking all of the goods of creation, bread and wine, and our very selves, and the whole world in which we live, and our dreams and our desires and every part of us, and we're holding them up to God, up to the divine, in order to be transformed. It's not the manipulation of the natural world, it's the inbreaking of the invisible world, which is very different. Now, for fallen human beings, for those of us who are captivated by the original sin, the world, the natural world, the visible world is deceptive because it tries to captivate all of our vision. The natural world is not bad, but our fallen eyes see it, and it wants to crowd in and be the only thing that we see. Everybody, we are born with a kind of eye cancer. Eye cancer medically is actually relatively rare. Only about 3,200 people every year in the United States are diagnosed with eye cancer, cancer of the eye. But 100% of people living upon the earth right now have a form of eye cancer, which it's genetic. We inherited it from our first parents. Venom came into their eyes at the time of the fall. The Blessed Mother was preserved from it at the time of her conception. It's not medical eye cancer, it's a kind of spiritual eye cancer. And God's mission of salvation was to come into the world, seeing our misery, seeing that we couldn't see beyond what was just visible. We couldn't see beyond the merely visible to the invisible world, which is all around us and behind everything that we could see. And he came to save us. He came to rescue us from our mortal blindness and give us the gift of faith, which is a new way of seeing beyond the merely visible into the truly real. This is the whole question of salvation. This is the whole epic adventure of the gospel. He loved us first. We didn't love him. He loved us first. This is the difference between Christianity, between our faith and every other religion. Every other religion goes out seeking God or seeking the divine. And in our faith, the divine comes seeking us. He came in search of us. He invaded this world, landed behind enemy lines so that he could set us free from our blindness, so that he could heal our cancer of the eyes. This story of salvation, this rescue mission, starts back in the Old Testament. We hear it on the first pages of the Bible in the creation account. Do you notice in the 6 days of creation, and then God rests on the seventh day, there's a peculiar order to it. And if you read it carefully, there are many, many things going on, but one of the things that's going on is a polemic or an argument against the worship of the sun. Because people who are captivated by the visible world look around for what they can worship, and of course what they will worship is the most splendor-filled, life-giving thing that they can see. And the most splendor-filled, life-giving thing in all of the natural world is the sun. And so people of every age and every civilization had their gods of the sun and worshiped the sun and built temples to the sun. And on the first pages of our Bible, we have the sun created on which day? The fourth day. And what's created before the sun? Light, days, even plants. And so there's a very subtle thing going on here. The scriptures are saying, don't worship the sun. It's not even that important. You can have all of these things before the sun. And in fact, what is important is the pinnacle of creation, what comes into being on the sixth day, humanity, man, woman. Good. And then when you turn from Genesis, from this argument against the worship of the sun, which is trying to open the eyes to the invisible, the breathing into the earth of the soul of man, you find Exodus. Exodus is a lot of fun to read, huh? Exodus is a great book. It starts out with all this adventure, right? Moses, Pharaoh, plagues, frogs. And then you go a few more chapters, right? You go to the 20th chapter and you have the giving of the law. And you have Moses up and encountering God. And you have thunder and lightning and trembles and earthquakes. It's incredible. And then you have a peculiar thing which comes right after that in Exodus. From chapters 25 to 40, all of a sudden you get detailed instructions about how to build a tabernacle, with instructions for vestments and poles and metals and curtains. And you're like, what happened here? I was at the height of epic saga, and all of a sudden I feel like I was thrown into an architect's drawer with a bunch of dumb blueprints. What in the world has happened? What's happened actually is of tremendous importance, because God is working with Moses to establish a bit of heaven on earth. He's providing for an invasion of the invisible world. He says to Moses this, "Let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell in their midst according to all that I show you concerning the pattern of the tabernacles and all its furnitures, you shall make it." And Moses did everything according to what the Lord showed him. And then for those 15 chapters, after everything that Moses makes, this is repeated. Moses did everything according to what the Lord showed him. What was the Lord showing him? The Lord was showing him the arrangement of heaven, the pattern of heaven, so that a piece of heaven could be established on earth. He was teaching Moses liturgy with the intention that if things are arranged such that God wanted them to be arranged in accord with his pattern, then he could come to dwell with us. And that's exactly what happens. In the building of the tabernacle, there's a heavenly reality is made space for, and then at the end, the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Once again, God is working to heal the blindness of his people. This continues all through the Old Testament, and then all of a sudden in the New Testament, here comes Jesus. And Jesus is constantly persistently calling his followers to a kind of allegiance to the invisible world. He comes to heal blindness. Notice that his favorite miracle in the Gospels is the healing of the blind. Notice also how much he warns and warns and warns his listeners against greed and the accumulation of wealth. Why? Not because the accumulation of wealth and the things of the world is bad in itself, but because it can become an obstacle. It can give people a false sense of security in this visible world and distract people from the invisible world. Notice Jesus standing in front of Pontius Pilate. As they speak, Pilate says, "Are you then a king?" And Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of this world. Were my kingdom of this world, my subjects would be rallying to my side and rising up to support me and rescue me. But my kingdom is not of this world." And all throughout his passion, Jesus is concealing something so as to reveal something. His whole life is meant to bring about a manifestation of the inbreaking of the invisible reality, the invisible world, into a human race which, because of the fall, has been blinded with wounded eyes and can no longer see beyond the visible world. And so the visible world has become highly deceptive for us. As a result of that, in every age of human existence, false gospels flood the world. And our age is an age of tremendous false gospels, very potent alternative accounts of reality which are opposed to the gospel of Christ. Consider the world in which we live. Consider our lives and the lives of those we love. We live in the most comfortable society in all of human history, and yet we have the highest levels of depression, boredom, and anxiety of any people who have ever lived. How is that possible? How is it possible that everything should be just like we want it, and we're disappointed in the whole thing? How is it possible that technological progress, which was supposed to give us all kinds of solutions to every human ill and suffering and difficulty, has not been able to make us happy? We have been catechized, even we faithful Catholics have been catechized into a scientistic, materialistic mindset. It's our fault, but not all our fault. Another way of saying it's not all our fault, but it's our fault too. That's another way of saying it. We have breathed in from the ambient culture all around us a different way of seeing the world than we have been taught by our faith. We are spiritual beings with transcendent souls and desires. And there are things in us that nothing can shake out of us. And yet these false gospels, with great skill and agility, try to worm their way into us, using things which on their own are just fine. Let me give you an example. Because we are spiritual beings with a transcendent appetite, we pray. Human beings in every age have prayed. Something has taken the place of meditation and heart-to-heart prayer, though, in our lives. I think it is the internet. I was one time on a transatlantic flight, flying into the daylight, and we were instructed by the steward staff on the airplane that even though it was daylight outside, all of us had to keep our window shades down so as not to interrupt anyone who was on their tablet or their phone. And there were rows and rows of people, hundreds of people, huddled over their devices as though they were at prayer. In social media, prayer is superficially mimicked. What is prayer but the offering of our thoughts and feelings and desires to another, to God? What is Twitter but the offering of our thoughts and feelings of desires to others? That's exactly what people are doing when they're posting. They're manifesting their thoughts, their feelings, and their desires. When we act with that kind of open-hearted vulnerability to God, to the Blessed Mother, to the saints, we are received with compassion and love. We experience healing around the woundedness of our hearts. We know consolation and we know encouragement. But when we display that kind of vulnerability and expose ourselves in this way to other fallen human beings, we open ourselves up to tremendous heartbreak and sometimes devastation. Why is it that young people kill themselves because they've been bullied on the internet? It's because the internet and not sacramental practice provides the interior life for human beings living in a technological, postmodern world. It's amazing how our devices root us in a pseudo-prayer fashion, in a pseudo-spiritual fashion, more deeply in the materialistic, scientistic world of our time. We're shopping for teapots on Amazon with all of the energies of our hearts that are meant for prayer and meditation and spiritual renewal. But we can't help it. We were made for prayer. We can't help it either that we were made for the invisible. And so we're constantly striving after the invisible. Let me give you an example of that. We've all emerged here recently from the coronavirus pandemic, which was a time of great bewilderment for so many of us. Early on in the pandemic, I remember with great interest as we were trying to think, okay, how do we navigate this at the University of Mary? How do we make decisions in respect to all of these things that are happening all around us? How do we balance the need for human interaction with the need for safety in a time of medical danger? All of these questions were coming. And I remember noticing that people would go on, pundits were going on television, and they were saying things like this: "Isn't it incredible? Isn't it unprecedented that something invisible like a virus could affect our world? That's never been heard of before. That something invisible would affect our world." Now, you can't say that if you believe in angels. You can't say that if you believe in sacraments. You can't say that. And the mantra from Catholic quarters was this. It was a good one, I think. Faith over fear. Good. Faith over fear. And I think that what was meant by that was that even though there's danger in this health crisis, our faith should give us the wherewithal so that it doesn't fundamentally rattle us at a deep level. But I think that there's something else that happened there. Fear actually began to, at a certain point in the pandemic, I don't know if you noticed, there was something like a switch that flipped. And fear began to replace faith in terms of its actual function. So fear of death by disease caused by an invisible virus became the organizing principle for all of human life, instead of being rescued from certain everlasting death by the love of God, which we believe by our faith is the organizing principle for all human life. Fear was functioning as a counterfeit faith in the way that the internet sometimes functions as counterfeit prayer. That's because we're captivated by the visible, materialist, scientistic world. Our weird moral wounds in the world in which we live are the same. Our scientific, mechanistic vision of things means that if an unborn baby is too small to be seen, she can be exterminated. Out of sight, out of mind. If my body doesn't match how I feel, I should change it, because what's visible about me is what's most real about me. The way that we understand our work oftentimes is strictly worldly. So we don't see the fruit of our labors and the work of our hands as having any meaningful effect on our own souls or the souls of others. And so we judge ourselves, and we're judged and evaluated strictly on economic return and visible measures of growth and success. And all of these moral wounds and this disorder in human life roots our hopes always in a changing, fallen world that will always break our hearts. The visible world cannot keep its promises to us because we were made for more than that. And so we end up, because we have imbibed this materialistic, scientific vision of things, instead of turning to the sacraments and prayer and our faith, we turn to good things in the world and then overindulge in them, overindulging in food and drink and drugs and gambling and sex and entertainment. You see, Bishop Fulda, I'm not cheering anybody up here. What can we do in the face of such a disaster? Cultural challenges and false gospels that make it so difficult for us not only to believe the truth of the Eucharist and treat it with reverence in our worship, but also to be fiercely allegiant, to give our hearts to the invisible world which the Eucharist represents as the sun and center of the whole thing for us. There's an old hymn that goes like this: turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. We don't believe in the Eucharist because we've allowed our minds to be captivated by a worldly vision of reality, a worldly vision of human life and of happiness. We're constricted by the merely visible. We're captivated. We're slaves. We can't understand the visible world, though, as a result, because the visible world doesn't make sense unless we understand what's behind it. Unless we have a compelling and coherent view of the world that includes the invisible, we can't make sense out of anything, and nothing has meaning. And that's true from the stance of our belief and also from the stance of our morality and our actions. If there is no God, we can do anything we want, but nothing that we do matters. But if there is a God, if there is an invisible world, then we cannot do anything we want, but everything we do matters and has deep significance. And all of a sudden, we've been saved from a meaningless life. We've been saved from mediocrity, and we can clamor like champions and come to fulfill our true vocations. Our eye cancer is fatal unless it is cured from another and his grace and his mercy. God gives to those who have the gift of faith a sacramental vision. And that's at the heart of Eucharistic belief, the sacramental vision. What does that mean? Jesus says to Philip at the Last Supper, "He who has seen me has seen the Father." And because God himself has invaded our world, Because the invisible has come into the visible, it is not, as Macbeth says, sound and fury signifying nothing. It is, his eye is on the sparrow and every hair of your head has been counted. Jesus is the sacrament, the visible sign. He is the sacrament of the Father. He is the image of the invisible God. Jesus is the sacrament of the Father. The church is the sacrament of Jesus. As is said on the first pages of Lumen Gentium and Gaudium et Spes, those two documents from the Second Vatican Council, and is said in that great Christmas carol that we all know from our childhood. Veiled in flesh, the Godhead see, hail the incarnate deity. Pleased as man with men to dwell, Jesus our Emmanuel. Hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King. Well, what does that mean? Hark the herald angels sing. I can't hear angels sing. Dogs can't even hear angels sing. Oh, yes, you can. I can't see the incarnate deity. I can't see Godhead veiled in flesh in that little baby in the manger. Yes, you can. Yes, you can, with the healed eyes of faith. The sacraments are particularly intense manifestations of the presence of God, visible signs of invisible reality. But there's a whole sacramental way of viewing the world that opens our eyes to true belief in those sacraments. Our bodies are sacraments of our souls. And so when we touch another human being, when we strike another person, in the marital embrace, there's a tremendous confluence and encounter between invisible realities happening. Meals are sacraments of the heavenly meal. And so food matters. We set times for our meals. We bring food out in courses. We teach our children manners at the dinner table. That's because it matters. God could have fed us with pills, but he didn't. Sacramental vision requires that food has a particular meaning to it. Time is a sacrament, strangely of eternity, which seems like the opposite of time. But notice, those of you who have been around long enough, notice that things that once seemed like a catastrophe in your life turn out to be a hidden blessing. Moments of disappointment when a door slams shut turn out to be the greatest moments of opportunity, and God is weaving time all the time. Time is a sacrament. The poor are sacraments. Mother Teresa gave the whole world new eyes to see Jesus in the distressing disguise. She used the word disguise of the poor. This whole reality is how we're called to see the world when our eyes begin to heal. Everything matters. There is sacramental vision in everything all around us. And if that's true, the world is an enchanted place. It's dangerous and perilous and exciting and marvelous and majestic and mysterious. And then all of the boredom, all of the inner pain flies out of our lives as we realize that we're in the midst of an epic adventure. This is the sacramental vision of the world. And what God does in the midst of that is gives us the great and precious gift of the Eucharist, which is the nuclear powerhouse of the sacramental vision that we're called to in the healing of our eyes in the lives of faith. Because in the midst of our lives, he himself has done, Jesus has done, in the new covenant what Moses and his father did in the old covenant. In the same way that a tabernacle was designed on Mount Sinai, from the 25th to the 40th chapter of the book of Exodus, so Jesus has designed a way for himself to dwell as the center heavenly reality of our existence here upon earth by giving us a command. How do you do with God's commands in your life? Do you obey them all the time? Father Ronald Knox once said that we obey almost none of God's commands. Almost nothing that Jesus said is something that we take interest in. 99% of Jesus' commands we ignore. Love your neighbor. Love your enemy. Pray for those who curse you. Turn the other cheek. But he said there is one command, strangely, through history, in every single age, has been obeyed. And it's this command: do this in memory of me. It's as though God, knowing our weakness and knowing our great need, somehow guaranteed that there would be at least one command in the Gospels that we would obey fearlessly and without fail in every generation. And we have done it. And the sacramental vision of the world has meant that when new lands are discovered, when the explorers washed up on the coast of St. Augustine, Florida, they said a Mass. When Father de Smet went to the height of the Rockies in Wyoming, he said a Mass. Why? Because the Eucharist makes the world go round. It's not just a good ceremony. When kings were crowned in the medieval world, they sang a Te Deum and they celebrated a Mass. Because the Eucharist sustains the whole world in existence. It's the source and summit and center of the Church's life and of human experience in the life of faith. What's needed for us is for that knowledge that we have of what the Eucharist is to go from being notional to being real. St. John Henry Newman makes a distinction between notional knowledge and real knowledge. Notional knowledge is knowledge that we assent to. And I think that most of us here assent to what the Church teaches about the Eucharist. But is it real knowledge for us? It needs to be. And that revival that the bishops have called for is as necessary for you and for me as for all the bad people in the survey. Why? Because we need to have a real knowledge. So if you know that you're going to go to Rome and you're getting ready, you're also living your life, that knowledge of going to Rome or going to France or going to Peru or going on a trip, heck, going to Bismarck to visit the University of Mary. It's just notional knowledge. But then all of a sudden you get on an airplane and you're sitting there and the engines fire up and all of a sudden you say, it's real. I'm really going. That's a different kind of knowledge. On the 4th of October, the University of Mary is dedicating the St. John School of Health Sciences. It's the largest school of our 5 schools in the university. We're dedicating it to St. Gianna Beretta Molla, who all of you know was a physician who in 1962 gave her life for her unborn child. And the child for whom she gave her life, who's now a medical doctor, Gianna Manuela Molla, will be here on October 4th, which if she had lived would have been St. Gianna's 100th birthday. And to get ready, I've been rereading the love letters between St. Gianna and her husband Pietro. And I think that they're very beautiful, but sometimes I roll my eyes a little bit. Because they write things to each other like, oh, you are the center of my life. You are the very best husband ever. I love you so much. Oh, there's never been a wife or a mother of children like you, oh, Gianna. And those are beautiful things, but they said them in the last 3 letters too. Why do they need to write them again and again and again while Pietro is, why are they writing to each other every single night before email? Well, it's to keep the knowledge and experience of their love not notional, but real. It's always been the conviction when men, for instance, are posted to far places on planet Earth, in the diplomatic service or in the military or in business, it's always been the sentiment that they somehow should stay in touch with their families. Not periodically, but often. Why? Because otherwise they'll forget to whom they belong. Knowledge can go from being real to being notional too. Let me tell you about when my knowledge of the teaching of the real presence of Jesus went from being notional to real. I grew up in a Catholic family. There's never been a time when I haven't believed what the Church believes about the Eucharist. I love the Lord, and I always have, and it's been a great gift in my life. When I was a freshman in college, my youngest brother, I'm the oldest of 8 children, 7 boys all in a row, and a little girl at the end. The 7th boy, Matthew, to whom I was very, very, very close, I was the oldest, he was the 7th, died in a farm accident. He was sledding down a hill on the day when the snow was melting in the springtime of my freshman year. My dad was moving bales and moving snow, and Matthew went right under the wheel of the tractor and died. And so it was a tremendously painful time for my family. I think that if we didn't have faith, we wouldn't have made it. And the summer afterward, I was far away from North Dakota, part of sort of a camp, a religious discernment experience. And I remember being at adoration late one night, kneeling in front of the Eucharist. And I couldn't pray. My heart was dry like sawdust. And I just missed my brother so much. I wanted to see him again. I missed everything about him. I missed his laugh and the color of his eyes and the smell of his hair. I missed everything. And I just wished that I could be with him. And then all of a sudden, I looked at the monstrance, and a grace flooded my heart, a realization that my brother, who died just before his 5th birthday, before the age of reason, that my brother was in heaven with Jesus. And I was here with Jesus in the Eucharist, and that he couldn't come back to me, but that I had to go to him. But until I could, the closest I could ever be to my little brother was there in the Eucharist, because that was Jesus, and he was with Jesus. That's the dynamic of Eucharistic faith, going from being notional to real. That's the kind of grace that God offers to us in the midst of our lives if we're paying attention and if we have hearts that are open to receive it. Brothers and sisters, at the beginning of this Eucharistic conference, I didn't want to make you grouchy, but I did want to tell you it is worse than you think. We need a revival among believers too. We need to be more and deeply and more profoundly transformed by the truth of our faith. And we need to take into ourselves a fierce allegiance to the invisible world. Faith in the Eucharist opens out the whole invisible world to us. An adoration of the Blessed Sacrament, which we will experience in just a moment, is nothing less than radiation therapy for our cancer of the eyes. When we gaze upon the Eucharist, the healing grace that comes from it are the same as the grace that Jesus unleashed upon all of those blind men he healed in the Gospels. It's the same healing, the same mercy, the same compassion, the same transformation that he offers to us in adoration of the Blessed Sacrament. Do this in memory of me. Let your will be done, O Father, on earth as it is in heaven. When I think of all of us struggling through this visible world, which tries to catch us by the hem of our garments, which tries so persistently to distract us away from that which is true and lasting and real, I pray that one day, when this anesthetic fog all around us melts and we see the world as it really is, when the mountain of reality that we gaze at all day, covered in snow, melts under the gaze of a loving God, and we see revealed underneath everything that the snow was hiding, all the beauty and growth and mercy and love of reality as it really is, that our blindness will truly be healed and our faith will dissolve into sight. But until then, we walk by faith and not by sight. And the Eucharist is a great mercy to us because it gives us a deep gaze into the invisible world. And we can trust God who has told us it is true. In the worst days of fighting of the Second World War, there was a man who had a lame leg and was unable to be conscripted into the army. In the course of the war, all of his children and his wife had been killed, except for one young boy who was the only thing left to him in all the world. He lived on the frontier between Germany and France, and the fighting one night was fierce, and he realized it was approaching the small cabin in which they lived. And he remembered that a quarter mile away was a deep hole where if they could reach it alive, they might be able to be safe. And so he picked up his son, and with all his strength and his lame leg, he ran as fast as he could to that hole, dodging gunfire and mortar blasts. And when he reached it, he said to his son, "I'm going to jump down, and then you jump after, and I'll catch you." And he jumped down, and because he was lame, he landed wrong, and ferocious pain seized his whole body. But his love for his son was deeper. And he shouted upward, "Son, jump!" And he could see his son there, lit by the blasts behind him. And his son began to sob and wouldn't move. He said, "Son, you've got to jump. Jump now!" And his son said, Daddy, I can't see you. I can't see you." And the father said, "It doesn't matter. I can see you. Jump." That's you and me. And our Father is waiting to catch us. His arms are strong. His word is true. And he gives us his Son on this altar such that our inability to see can be open just enough for us to trust him entirely. May it be so. Thanks for listening, everybody.